This is the second discussion about nature and nurture that I've had. The first one was over a year ago, and it's been on my mind a lot recently, but it also is one of those things that I find can quickly go nowhere, almost like the discussion of whether God exists or not. I find that sometimes those conversations get tiresome very quickly because it comes down to like, well, you can't possibly know something, facts versus faith, belief, science, whatever, evidence, that kind of thing. I think that sometimes those topics are worth exploring even though you can't come up with specific answers, but again, depending on how it's framed and who you're talking with, etc., it can become just pointless. So I discussed it a little over a year ago, and recently nature and nurture have been on my mind a lot. Part of that is due to wanting to change things within myself, certain behaviors and ideas or processes, actions, feelings, coping, etc. And part of it is having discussions with my partner about how to possibly affect change in behavior in others in like the context of a parent-child relationship. Part of it is media, like books I've been reading. I had a movie review for We Need to Talk About Kevin a couple weeks back. That is very much based on that. So just a lot of things that recently have come up. But I think the main one in how I guess I'm discussing this and where a lot of my examples and things are coming from is thinking about these changes that I want to affect within myself and how can I do that. And so exploring this idea has become somewhat useful and helpful, but also it's just interesting. It's one of those ones where sometimes you end up digging up way more questions than you have answers to, just because the nature of the topic doesn't enable you to come up with a clear, concise solution to a problem. So for myself, some of the things I've been thinking of just like changing certain behaviors, and I've just been thinking, I'm trying to get to like my big point here because I don't feel like this lasts long, but like again, part of this is exploring the topic, and part of this stuff I have been thinking of the past couple days and weeks. And one of the things is that what is nature? I think nature, is how I'm going to define it right now, is what you are born with that you can't change. So that gets tough because I have said phrases that I just realized soon after saying them don't make much sense, like you can change your nature, and I'm like, I don't think you can. So let's say, for example, that there's something within me, nature-wise, chemically, in my brain and body that responds to certain stimuli in a more impatient and or aggressive way than somebody else. It's hard to determine that that's nature versus nurture. It's hard to determine that that is a natural response versus one that was conditioned in me through modeling and example, or education, conversation, training, implicit or explicit. It's hard to say that, but let's just say that that's the truth. Let's just say that there is something within me, naturally, in my chemical being, that responds to certain stimuli with more frustration and less patience than someone else who responds differently to it, and it's not because of what's nurtured in us. Let's just say that and pretend it's a fact, and that we can know that thing. I believe it's really hard to know that thing, just as an aside. But let's say that we know that it is my nature. If I said I was changing my nature, I think by definition, I can't change my nature. So if I'm saying, you know what, I am going to create new neural pathways, synapses, etc., in the mind, in the brain. I'm going to condition myself, which I believe someone can do, but we're going to get to that. If I'm capable, and I can condition myself by, so for an example, let me take road rage as an example. Let's just say someone doesn't signal, and it's not directly affecting me in that moment, but I witness it, and let's say, for whatever reason, my response is to honk and give them the finger and swear at them even though they can't hear it. That has never been my response, by the way, but it does upset me. So I think for myself and what I have seen in my behaviors, which have to deal with road rage type of scenarios, I've conditioned myself over time to not even, because sometimes in the car alone I speak out loud and I'm like, what are you doing? Like, what the hell? Or it's like, why don't you do that? Or I shake my head. And I've conditioned myself over time to not do some of those things, or not do them as much, or not do them as aggressively, or whatever. So that is conditioning on my part that I've been able to analyze. When I do that thing, I just perpetuate my own discomfort, whereas if I can just see it, because I can't not see it. Like, that is a nature thing for me. I believe like it is in my nature that I see that thing in front of me. Like, observance is a thing, and I wonder how much you could even nurture yourself into being less observant or more observant. I don't know, but I see the thing because it crosses my eyes, and my eyes have detected it, and there's a signal, and my brain says this is what happened, and then I react to that stimuli, but I have been able to nurture my response and condition myself to react less, because if I react extremely, then that perpetuates a bad feeling for me, and I can't do anything about it, and all these other logical, rational things that, like, I could still have a feeling here, but that feeling is much more subdued, and that feeling is just, like, slight annoyance, or just, like, a notice, like, oh, they didn't signal, rather than losing my stuff in the car to myself, just being like, what the hell, like, why would you do, what an idiot, like. And sometimes I'm sure I still do that to a degree, but again, I have conditioned myself to do that a lot less in frequency and extremity. So, again, so if it was in my nature to do that, to have that reaction, I have used that phrase, I've conditioned my nature, or I've changed my nature, or, yeah. And I don't think that's possible. So what I came to the realization of was that response was never something that was in my nature to have that response. Like, I would have to, and here's the thing, I would have had to have that scenario for the first time without any influence in order to respond to it, quote unquote, naturally. But I have been in other people's vehicles as a passenger before, like, there was behavior that was modeled that does not necessarily mean that I behaved the way that other people behaved, but that at a certain age and maturity level, I could reflect on the behaviors that people modeled and decide in a way of what I would do or what I wouldn't do. So there is some choice making, and there's some implicit habit forming stuff through just someone else's modeling to a degree, and how I felt about it. And again, some of it is definitely more subversive, and some of it is much more a choice that is deliberately being made. So, I think what is in my nature then would be the capability to nurture myself. I think that is where the nature part comes from. Is like, it is not that response wasn't my nature. Something in my nature might be more easily frustrated by a certain category of things, and that not signaling might fit into that category of things that makes me a little more apt to be irritable quickly than somebody else. That is a thing that possibly could be in my nature, but also what is for sure in my nature is my capability. So if I talk about chemicals, this is where the example goes to things that are not in my control necessarily. So if it was a chromosome issue, or if I compare myself to someone who has a severe, who is not neurotypical, or they are sincerely and obviously and factually and scientifically not as cognitively able as I am, they don't have the capability to possibly they do not have the capability in their nature to change certain behaviors, to condition themselves to act differently, or to change how they do things on their own, because they don't have the nature, they don't have the capability, the mental capability to reflect on what has happened, or to be aware of what has happened, and then to maybe make a realization that that's not what they want, versus they want this other thing better, and that when that stimuli comes around next time, they could do something different with that stimuli and respond to it in a different way. So I believe that I have something in my nature that allows me that capability. And this is where things get to a huge gray area, but this is what is helping me become more empathetic and patient and understanding and compassionate. I believe that some people are just compassionate people that might have something to do with their nature. I do believe there are some personality traits that are in people's nature, and some of it is genetic, and some of it is conditioned. And again, through your upbringing or your just environment that you were nurtured in. So I believe there are some people that are very compassionate, but they arrive at that very naturally, or it was conditioned into them, not that they're conditioning themselves. And I believe that is a truth. For me, in order to become more compassionate, because I believe I need that in my life, this is the path that has gotten me here, is this gray area of, sometimes I categorize this as can't and won't. And I'm realizing there's way more can't than I thought. And what I mean by can't and won't is someone that can't, they are not capable of acting certain ways, and someone who just won't act certain ways. So if I use an example of someone who has, let's just take memory for an example. When people make a joke about selective memory, memory is something, for the most part, we can't control how well our memory acts, how much memory we have, or what that is. Like, we have a certain amount, and I think that there are some things that people have done research when it comes to Alzheimer's and things like, doing crosswords or whatever. There's certain mind puzzles that you can do that help you retain information, and you can work on your memory. But there's also just a genetic thing where some people have better short-term or long-term memory than others, and that seems to be a chemical thing within someone's nature. And there are things that you might be able to condition yourself to do. But again, it would be in your nature to have the capability to enhance that. So even though you're not born with it, it would be like, podcast listeners are going to get lost in the visuals here of my fingers, but it would be like if you had a box and there is a small box, or let's say a bar graph, because it's moving my fingers, and this is how much capability someone has, and they're born with it, let's just say 90% of it is already maxed out for their, let's just say, long-term memory, to be specific, is that this is how much they have capable forever. And they start out with 90%, they can only move up that 10. Whereas if someone has one that's double the size, and they maybe are also born with 90% of it, or not 90%, let's say they're born with the same amount this person has down here, but they have the capability of enhancing that. Like, I believe that's where the nature is. The nature is in the capability of improving or not being able to improve. So I'm trying to go back to a previous example that I already forgot. But that gray area for me becomes this thing that makes me more compassionate, because I'm realizing that can't and that won't. There's way more can't than there is won't. That for a long time I just believed and understood and thought very incorrectly that so many people were just incredibly selfish and were incredibly lazy and etc., that they didn't want to put the hard work in, and it was more of a won't, that they won't do this thing because they would rather do this other thing. But there's a certain amount of nature that I just didn't account for. And I just thought, like, oh, if this person is very obviously not neurotypical, if they are very obviously not as cognitively able as I am, then I would have completely different expectations. But for everyone that I can visually see how they act for even like 30 seconds or less, and I would put that person into a category the same as me, that was so incorrect. Like, to compare, I mean, is very just natural for me. And I think most people, if you are being honest, that is how we learn a lot of the time, is we compare things of this is not that thing. Like, orange is not blue, it is not black, it is not this, it is not that. Like, it is, you know what I mean? Like, we compare things in a way to learn what is good, what is bad, what we like, what we don't like, tastes, bitter versus sweet, whatever. And also behaviors, right? What is a good behavior? What is a bad behavior? If you want to categorize it that way, obviously things are very nuanced, and there's a spectrum for everything, even with colors. Orange is not just one color. There are different shades of orange. Anyway, I am I respect and understand and am an advocate for nuance when it comes to people, absolutely, which is why I hate cancel culture, but that is a whole other thing, and it's its own thing that I should probably revisit sometime. But anyway, so I judge people pretty quickly, or at least I did even worse beforehand. But again, this is what is helping me. I don't believe that in my nature there was a lot of compassion. And I don't believe it's because of just nurture, because if I look back on my circumstances, I see that there were things that gave me an example for compassion, for sure. But there's a certain thing in my nature that just isn't as compassionate as some other blood relatives that I have. Again, some of that I think is just nature for me. And I've had to, I am capable, I would say I am capable in a lot of areas of conditioning myself. I have that capability, and this also relates to last week's conversation about counseling, where it was like this crappy realization almost that I have more work to do and I'm capable of that work, whereas other people who aren't capable of it almost get a free pass to not do that work because they don't have the capability to do it. And it's like, okay, well, I have capability to work harder, therefore I can work harder. Again, we reach this thing of equality and equity and the differences there. So I have a capability to condition myself. That's great. People who don't have that, though, are maybe more so than I thought. But there's such a massive spectrum of someone who, of that level of can't. They can't maybe, again, if I go to, like, again, the memory thing, or if I go to, like, attention span, I think that there are some things that I can do to help myself, to condition myself to have more of an attention span. But there's a limit to that. There is a ceiling to that. It's not infinite. I believe that, just like that bar graph thing I was doing, someone's nature may have more capability than mine in like certain attention categories where my ceiling is lower than theirs. And I do have a certain amount that I can nurture within myself, and I have certain things that I can do that I have done to condition myself to be more focused on a task, and I have understood things about myself. but someone else might have 50% less of the capability to reflect on what's not working for them in that attention scenario, first of all. And if they do reflect on that and they try to implement changes, maybe they just don't have the capability, the chemical capability, to focus on that thing. There are some people who can sit down and read for an hour straight, and I don't think I can ever be that person or I've ever been that person. That's not true. If I reflect on it, it's not true. But again, there's so much conditioning that it's ridiculous. And now I'm lost. I've gone off the rails completely, and I know that. I'm going to try to get back. But like, I can't decide if there's more nature than I thought or more nurture than I thought, because then I just realized, like, no. I remember in high school there was a specific book, and I read it all night, and I finished it. We got it that day. It's called Flowers for Algernon, which is very interesting because that is one of the books that I was talking about with nature and nurture, and like why this topic has been on my mind. But I read it overnight. At that point, I could read for an extended period of time. There were other things that I could do for an extended period of time too, and it wasn't just because I had the time, but because I had the mental, emotional capabilities at that time to stay focused on those things, like listening to music and doing nothing else. And I think that for me, definitely technology, smartphones, computers, etc., have played a role in me conditioning myself to have less of an attention span. But again, I do think that there's a certain amount of capability that someone just has, period, and that their cup might not be as big as someone else's that they can fill, or that someone else's cup maybe of patience has more depth than mine does. And I do believe that there's wiggle room in my cup, that I can learn and condition myself to behave better or act differently or have more patience or whatever to cope with things and process things even differently. But yeah, so as for that ADHD component, the focus thing or the attention thing, is that I think that there is, for some people, a chemical inability or a chemical cap that they just can't get past, and therefore the expectation has to be different. This is kind of why my teaching philosophy is that every student is a special needs student, because everyone is unique and has a different capability and desire and style and everything else, personality, whatever, and you do have to be aware of those things when teaching or when trying to educate in any way somebody else, or to affect change, or to whatever, have a relationship with a person, right? Like, you deal with people differently. Different friends of mine I talk to differently. And to try and maybe even get the same type of response, I have to deliver the message differently. Anyway, this just goes back, as I'm wrapping things up, to this realization that, like, again, for me, I have to logic myself into being more compassionate. For other people, I just believe they're born with a certain amount of compassion. For other people, their conditioning maybe was just different, and they have been conditioned really early on to have that compassion where they just understand it innately, and they don't have to logic themselves into it. There's a certain amount of compassion I have in certain very specific categories that are they've always been there. For me, like animals, specifically dogs, like that has been something that has always been there for me. It doesn't extend to every single animal. Part of that's conditioning. But again, for me, for some reason, compassion and love for dogs and other animals, there's certain groups and categories that for as long as I've remembered, they've been there. And part of that is a certain amount of conditioning too. But that is more emotional to me. I didn't have to logic myself into that. Whatever conditioning in my environment that was there to foster what already in my nature was there, just happened to be there. Circumstances with nature, just a lot are coincidental, I feel, and some are intentional, which is why these discussions are happening of like, how can I intentionally push myself to be a better person? Where are my limits? What is my capability? How do I do that? And why do I do that? And where does it start and end and all those things? So again, I don't know if I'm saying that there's more nature and there's more nurture than I thought. Like the depth and breadth and just it it reaches far further than I thought. It reaches down deeper. Like, it's more diverse and expansive. And this is a good thing for me. Again, logicking myself into compassion, that sounds really weird, but that's where this has gotten me right now. Like, this, thinking about nature and nurture, has given me a way to explain in a much more, again, logical versus emotional, has given me the capabilities to understand compassion in a different way that pushes what I naturally feel, and I can extend that further than I could without the logic, because there were things I just like didn't understand. And again, part of that is that big, huge gray area of like the spectrum of people and how, why is that person, why am I able, I mean, physical addiction's a thing too, right? Like, why was I able to just say, okay, I think I have a little bit of a drinking problem, I'm going to stop drinking and that's it. Versus some other people that genetically are more prone to alcoholism than I am, and they would have much more of a physical response to that withdrawal and that stoppage, and how much chemically in their brain are they capable of, again, addictive personalities and stuff like that. Like, there's a certain amount of nature in there that isn't as controllable. And just that amount of, I don't believe that, oh, that's just who they are, and that's it. I still want to push people, including myself, to be better, and it's never good enough to be like, that's just who they are. That's it. I think that is who they are because that's who they want to be sometimes, or because they don't have a certain amount of strength or will to be someone different. There's a certain amount of capability that they don't have either. There's a certain amount of capability for me that caps out on some things that are why certain things in my life haven't been changing, or have been changing really, really, really slow, because of my certain capabilities and limits and ceilings, and other people's are different. So, but that's the thing. This isn't for me a way of saying, oh, that's just them. They're just garbage. They suck as a human being, and you just got to live with that. Like, to a degree, I do have to live with that, and I don't want it to affect me or negatively impact me if I can help it. But at the same time, I have something in me that says, I think they can do better. I don't know. Here's the thing. Before, it was like, that person can do better, unless it was very obvious by cognition-based information that they could not do better, unless it was very obvious that they could not be really that different because they don't have the chemical, physical capabilities of being different. If that wasn't apparent, I would always just put that on someone. You can do better, and maybe they can, but they can't do better as quickly or as effectively or to the extreme that I'm putting on them and the standard I'm putting on them. It's just an incapability. And I think that's where I end this off. It is kind of why, when I talk about, with relationships where I have talked about chemistry versus compatibility, why incompatibility for me is not something that I would take to heart. And that comes with, I mean, and that's partially desires and stuff too, right? Like, people just can be incompatible because they have different goals and they have whatever, and that doesn't make someone else less than because they don't fit into your life in a certain way. But anyway, this topic is related just because, like, incompatibilities sometimes are like, hey, that's just who they are, and this is who I am right now, and right now this doesn't work for us, and that's okay. And it's the same thing with, like, human beings in other situations, like, hey, that's who they are right now, and I don't know what's going on with them, and maybe they have an ability to be somewhere different, but right now they're not doing that, and if it doesn't directly affect me, and I can't affect any change in them, then it shouldn't take up that much more real estate in my mind and frustrate me and make me aggravated, because that is something I have difficulty with, and this is helping me get past that. So that is Nature Nurture Part 2, which probably has a title of Logicking Myself into Compassion, I think is what it's going to be called, which is just a weird realization, but that also just plays to the fact of like I apparently in my nature have a capability to do that, to logic myself into compassion, to condition myself into compassion, which we often, I think, as people see as a much more natural trait in somebody rather than a learned behavior that can be changed. But I'm working on it.